The P-47 Thunderbolt was the largest single-engine fighter of the Second World War. It weighed 10,000 pounds empty, stretched 36 feet from nose to tail, and carried 8 heavy machine guns in its wings. Yet it was not built to fight in the mud and the flak where it made its name. It was built to fight in the coldest, thinnest air, 5 miles above the ground. Bomber crews needed an escort that could still breathe at 30,000 feet. Interceptor pilots needed to reach enemy machines that flew higher every year. Designers needed an engine that would not choke in the stratosphere. That small, high requirement produced a very large machine. More than 15,000 were built, across 3 factories, at a scale closer to automobiles than to aircraft. And then the war took the plane away from the sky it was drawn for. It sent the Thunderbolt down to treetop height, into rail yards and troop columns and anti-aircraft fire. The price was paid up front. It drank 100 gallons of fuel an hour, and at first it could not even reach Germany. It was neither a nimble interceptor nor a light escort. It occupied the space between them and beyond them. It was, in the plainest terms, a flying power plant with wings and a pilot bolted to the front. The engine and its machinery came first, and the airplane was built around them. Everything the Thunderbolt did well, and everything it did badly, came from that single decision. It could climb to 42,000 feet. It could outdive anything the enemy flew. It could absorb damage that tore other fighters apart. And it carried all of that on a frame so heavy that lightness was never an option again. That leaves the question the entire program was built to answer. How do you build a fighter heavy enough to survive everything the enemy can throw at it, without making it too heavy to do the job it was built for? The answer took 4 years, 3 factories, and a war that refused to use the airplane the way its designers intended. The Thunderbolt's story would travel from a drawing sketched on a commuter train to factory floors on Long Island and in Indiana, from English runways to the high air over Germany, down into the hedgerows of Normandy, across the frozen roads of the Ardennes, out to the Pacific, and finally into the air forces of a dozen other nations that flew it for another 20 years. It began with a problem no American fighter of 1940 could solve. American fighters could fly. Above 20,000 feet, most of them could barely fight. That was the uncomfortable fact behind the Thunderbolt, and it did not come from a laboratory. It came from Europe, where the air war of 1939 and 1940 was being fought higher than American planners had prepared for. The trouble was the air itself. At 25,000 feet, the atmosphere holds roughly a third of the oxygen it holds at sea level. An engine that breathes that thin air makes a fraction of its rated power. A fighter that is quick and sharp near the ground turns sluggish and soft in the stratosphere, wallowing where it should be climbing, mushing where it should be turning. The frontline American pursuit planes of 1940, the Curtiss P-40 and the Bell P-39, were built around engines that faded badly with altitude. Below 15,000 feet they could fight. Above it, they were being asked to box with one arm. The enemy did not have the same problem, or did not have it as badly. Combat reports coming back from the fighting in Europe described air battles happening at heights American designs simply could not reach with any strength. Bombers were being escorted and intercepted in the high air. Reconnaissance aircraft crossed over at altitudes where interceptors arrived too late and too weak to do anything about them. An air force that could not fight at height did not merely lose the top of the sky. It surrendered the choice of when and where to fight. The lesson had a hard edge, because height in air combat is not a luxury. It is an advantage that can be spent. An airplane that holds the altitude can choose to dive into a fight and choose to climb a way out of it, dictating every pass, while the airplane below can only react and hope. The fighter with the height decides whether there is a battle at all. An Air Force flying machines that ran out of strength at 20,000 feet was handing that decision permanently to the enemy, agreeing in advance to fight only on the enemy's terms, only when the enemy chose to come down. No amount of courage in the cockpit could buy back what the engine gave away. The problem was not the pilots. It was the thin air and the machines that could not master it. There was a known answer, and it was the turbo supercharger. A supercharger is an air pump that forces extra air into the engine, restoring at altitude the density the atmosphere has taken away. A turbo supercharger drives that pump with the engine's own exhaust gas, energy that would otherwise blow out the back and be wasted. The device worked. General Electric had spent years developing it in the United States. But it was bulky, it was heavy, and it needed a great deal of plumbing. To route exhaust back to a turbine, spin a compressor, and pipe the pressurized air forward again took length, volume, and structure. A designer who wanted high-altitude performance had to find room for all of it, and then find a way to lift it into the air. Altitude was not only an engineering problem, it was a human one. 5 miles up, the cockpit was murderously cold, and a pilot without a working oxygen supply lost his judgment before he lost consciousness. The fight itself changed character at that height. Speeds were higher, the air gave less bite to the controls, and an airplane that felt lively near the ground felt distant and vague up in the cold. A pilot who arrived at altitude in a machine that had spent its strength climbing there was already beaten before the first shot. Very few designs had answered the problem at all. Among American fighters, the twin-engined Lightning carried turbo-superchargers and could fight up high, but it was large, expensive, and scarce. The single-engined pursuit planes that made up the bulk of the force could not follow. The gap was not a matter of a few hundred feet. It was the entire top of the sky. That was the requirement taking shape inside the Army Air Corps. What the service wanted was a fighter that could genuinely fight where the war was moving. High, cold, and fast. The specification hardened around numbers that would have looked extravagant a few years earlier. It wanted a speed of 400 miles an hour at 25,000 feet. It wanted heavy firepower, on the order of 8 machine guns. It wanted armor plate for the pilot and self-sealing fuel tanks that would not turn a single hit into a fireball. It wanted a fuel load above 300 gallons. And it wanted all of that to perform at heights where the existing fighters ran out of breath. Those numbers deserve a moment, because they measured the size of the leap being asked for. 400 miles an hour was near the edge of what any fighter of 1940 could do at any height. And to ask for it at 25,000 feet, where the air fought the airplane every way it could, was to ask for a machine well beyond the frontline pursuit planes then in service. 8 machine guns was a heavier battery than most fighters carried. Armor and self-sealing tanks added weight that the older, lighter designs had done without. Each line of the requirement pushed toward a bigger, heavier, more powerful airplane, and taken together they described something that did not yet exist. The specification was not a refinement of the P-40. It was a demand for a new class of fighter, and it could only be met by a designer willing to abandon the assumptions the old fighters were built on. Here, a popular idea about the Thunderbolt deserves correction. It is often remembered as a ground attack machine, a plane made to smash tanks and trains, because that is the work it became famous for. The record shows the opposite intention. The P-47 was conceived as a high-altitude interceptor and escort, a creature of the stratosphere. The mud came later, and it came against the grain of the design. Everything about the airplane's size, its engine, and its plumbing pointed upward, not down. That is where the first trade-off was set, before a single rivet was driven. Altitude performance demanded a turbo supercharger. A turbo supercharger demanded volume, the internal space to hold the turbine, the ducting, and the cooling. Volume demanded structure, and structure demanded weight. Every pound spent on breathing at height was a pound that had to be carried everywhere, at every altitude, for the life of the airframe. The designers were not being asked to build a light fighter with good high-altitude manners. They were being asked to accept a heavy one and make it fly well anyway. The requirement now existed on paper, sharp and demanding. Someone still had to draw the machine that met it, and the man who did threw away his first answer to do it. Alexander Kartveli did not refine a small fighter into a big one. He threw the small fighter away and started over. The story of the Thunderbolt is often told as a smooth evolution, one design growing naturally into the next. The truth has a sharper edge. At the decisive moment, the chief engineer abandoned the airplane he had been building and began again from the other end of the problem. The lineage was real, and it mattered. The company traced back to Alexander de Seversky, a Russian-born aviator and inventor who had lost a leg in the First World War and still flew, who held hundreds of patents, and who built fighters around a distinctive, broad, thin, semi-elliptical wing. His firm produced the P-35 in the middle of the 1930s, and from it grew a line of increasingly capable pursuit designs. In 1939, after financial trouble, the company was reorganized as the Republic Aviation Corporation, and Seversky himself was pushed out of the business he had founded. What remained was his engineering, his wing, and his chief designer, Kartveli, another Russian expatriate, who inherited the lineage and the problem. That lineage had already produced turbo-supercharged experiments. The YP-43 Lancer carried its turbine in the rear fuselage and reached the higher speeds the Air Corps wanted, and it taught Republic how to package the machinery inside an airframe. The Lancer was never a great fighter. It was lightly built, lightly armed, and outclassed by the time it appeared. But it was a school. It taught the company how to run, exhaust the length of a fuselage to a turbine in the tail, how to duct the pressurized air forward again, and how to make the whole delicate arrangement survive the vibration and heat of flight. When Kartveli came to draw the Thunderbolt, he was not inventing the turbo-supercharged fighter from nothing. He was applying a hard-won lesson at a far larger scale, taking the plumbing that had made the Lancer merely adequate and building an airplane worthy of it. From it grew proposals for lighter fighters, the XP-47 and the XP-47A, small aircraft built around more modest engines. For a time, that was the path. Then combat reports from Europe made the small path look like a dead end. A light fighter could not carry the guns, the armor, the fuel, and the turbo supercharger the war now demanded. Something had to give, and Kartveli decided it would be the idea of lightness itself. The image that survives is of Kartveli sketching the new design on the train back to New York, choosing bulk on purpose, drawing an airplane around the biggest engine and the full turbo installation rather than trimming to fit a smaller one. The engine at the center of the new drawing was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder air-cooled radial that would grow to 2,000 horsepower and beyond. Around it went the guns, the armor, the tanks, and all the plumbing the turbo supercharger needed. The result on paper weighed more than any single-engine fighter the Air Corps had bought. Kartveli understood exactly what he was drawing, and he said so. His airplane, he remarked, would be a dinosaur, but it would be a dinosaur with good proportions. It was an honest description. He was not promising a small, sharp fighter. He was promising a very large one that was balanced, clean, and built with care around its enormous heart. The bet was that good proportions and enough power could make bulk fly. It was a bet the Army was willing to place, and the willingness is itself part of the story. For years, the prevailing wisdom, in the United States and elsewhere, had leaned toward light, agile fighters, and Seversky's insistence that the future belonged to bigger, faster, higher-flying machines had been an unfashionable minority view, the kind of thing that had helped cost him his company. Now the combat reports from Europe were reading like a vindication of exactly that view, and the service that had doubted the heavy fighter found itself ordering the heaviest one yet drawn. The Thunderbolt was, in that sense, an argument settled in aluminum. The men who had believed fighters must grow heavier to survive the modern battlefield had been told they were wrong, and the airplane taking shape on Long Island was about to prove them right. That reversal, from dismissed idea to urgent priority, is why the program moved as fast as it did, and why so much was staked on a machine no one had yet seen fly. The confidence in the design ran ahead of the flying. The Army placed a production order for the airplane in September of 1940, months before the prototype ever left the ground, committing to hundreds of aircraft on the strength of the drawings and the promise. That was a measure of how badly the high-altitude fighter was needed. It was also a gamble that the intricate machine could be made to work, and made in quantity, before anyone had seen it fly. The prototype was the P-47B. It was rolled out in early May of 1941 and flown for the first time on the 6th of that month, with the test pilot Lowery Brabham at the controls. It weighed over 12,000 pounds, an astonishing figure for a single-engine fighter of its day, nearly twice the weight of some of the machines it was meant to replace. Its fuel load came in slightly under the specification, a few gallons short, a small sign of how hard it was to fit everything the requirement asked into even so large an airframe. The first flight ended with a precautionary landing, and the test program that followed exposed the price of all that internal machinery. Controls were heavy. Systems were elaborate. The airplane was complex in ways that simpler fighters were not, and each system was one more thing that could fail, one more thing a mechanic would have to understand. Here, a second popular idea deserves correction. The Thunderbolt is sometimes described as the invention of one man, Kartveli's airplane and Kartveli's alone. That claim requires restraint. Kartveli led the design, and the crucial decision to go big was his. But he stood on Seversky's wing and Seversky's company, on the turbo supercharger lineage of the P-43, on Pratt & Whitney's engine, and on General Electric's turbine. The Thunderbolt was a system assembled from parts that many hands had built. Kartveli's genius was in the arrangement, in making those heavy pieces into a coherent, flyable whole. That is a real achievement, and it does not need the myth of the lone inventor to stand. The trade-off in this chapter is the one Kartveli chose with open eyes. Committing to the big engine and the full turbo supercharger bought altitude, firepower, and growth room that a smaller design could never have. It cost him a fighter that weighed roughly twice what its rivals did, with all the consequences that weight would bring in climb, in range, and in the simple effort of getting off the ground. He did not stumble into the weight. He accepted it as the entry fee for everything else. The month of evaluation that followed the first flight was where the airplane stopped being a promise and started being a problem to solve. Test flying revealed the faults that drawings never show. The controls grew troublesome at high speed and high altitude, the very conditions the airplane existed to fight in. Fabric-covered control surfaces, a common feature of the day, could not always take the loads and had to be reconsidered. The turbo supercharger's smoking fault had to be traced and cured. Each of these was the kind of trouble that came with complexity, and each had to be fixed before the airplane could be trusted to a squadron pilot. The prototype had proven the concept could fly. It had also proven how much work stood between a flying prototype and a fighter fit for war. The drawing was radical, and the first flight proved it could leave the ground. Turning that drawing into thousands of identical airplanes would prove harder than anyone had sketched, and before that, the airplane's own numbers had to be understood, because none of them were free. Every number on the Thunderbolt's specification sheet was an argument the designers had already had. Nothing about the airplane was free, and the numbers show where each decision was paid for. The empty weight was 10,000 pounds. Loaded for a normal mission, it grossed over 13,000. Fully loaded for the heaviest work, it could reach 17,500 pounds, near 8 tons, a figure that belonged to a light bomber rather than a fighter. That mass is the single fact from which most of the airplane's virtues and most of its faults descend. The dimensions matched the mass. The Thunderbolt stretched about 36 feet from nose to tail and spanned nearly 41 feet across the wing, and it stood over 14 feet tall at the tail, a big airplane by any measure of its generation. On the ground, it loomed over the pilots who flew it, tall on its long legs, broad in the belly, a machine that looked as heavy as it was. There was nothing sleek or small about it, and Republic never pretended otherwise. The wing carried it on 300 square feet of that broad, semi-elliptical planform inherited from Seversky. It was a large wing, and it needed to be, because a heavy airplane on a small wing lands fast and climbs poorly. Even so, the wing loading was high, and the Thunderbolt came into land quickly and firmly, a handful for a new pilot used to lighter machines. The airplane rewarded speed and punished hesitation near the ground. At the front turned a propeller 13 feet across, a four-bladed Curtiss electric unit sized to convert 2,000 horsepower into thrust. A propeller that large creates a problem of its own. It needs ground clearance, and ground clearance needs tall landing gear. But the guns and their ammunition lived in the wings, and the landing gear had to retract without cutting into that space. Republic's solution was landing gear that shortened as it retracted and lengthened as it came down, a mechanism that gave the huge propeller room to spin without stealing room from the guns. It was clever. And it was one more piece of complication in an airplane already full of it. Inside the fuselage sat the reason for everything. The R-2800 engine drew fuel at a rate that defined the airplane's reach. 305 gallons of internal fuel sounds generous until the engine's appetite is set beside it. At high power, the Double Wasp could drink on the order of 100 gallons an hour. A large tank feeding a thirsty engine does not make a long-ranged airplane. It makes an airplane that carries a lot of fuel and burns it fast, and that arithmetic would shape the Thunderbolt's first year of combat more than any enemy did. The early machines also carried a flaw that came straight from their complexity. In testing, oil pooled in the turbo supercharger ducting during ground running. When the pilot climbed and the system's controls shifted, that oil could burn off and send smoke into the cockpit, an alarming fault in a new fighter. It was traced and corrected during the evaluation, one problem among the many that a machine this intricate presented. Simpler fighters did not smoke their pilots because simpler fighters did not carry a river of ducting through the fuselage. The thirst had a second-order consequence that shaped the airplane's tactics as much as its range. Because the engine drank so hard at high power, a Thunderbolt pilot had to think constantly about fuel, throttling back where he could, planning his combat around the gallons in his tanks, knowing that a long fight at full power could leave him short over hostile ground. The airplane that felt so strong at altitude was also, at first, tethered by its own appetite, and that tether governed how far its pilots dared to chase, how long they dared to fight, and when they had to break off and turn for home no matter how the battle was going. The fuel gauge was as much a part of the Thunderbolt's early combat as the gun sight. It would take the whole apparatus of external tanks, described later, to loosen that tether. And until it did, the airplane's greatest limitation was not the enemy, but the arithmetic of its own engine. Set against those costs were the gifts the weight and the machinery bought. The service ceiling reached 42,000 feet, the top of the practical sky, higher than most of what it would meet. With the turbo supercharger doing its work, the airplane could climb from sea level toward 15,000 feet in about 5 minutes, and it kept its power where lighter fighters lost theirs. Up high, in the cold, thin air the design was drawn for, the Thunderbolt came into its own. It was fast, it was steady, and it did not run out of breath. The cockpit itself was part of the bargain. In an airplane this large, there was room, and pilots noticed it. More than one described the Thunderbolt's cockpit as roomy and comfortable, a place a big man could settle into, one flyer likening it to a lounge chair. That comfort was not a luxury for its own sake. A pilot flew missions that lasted hours, at altitude, in the cold, and space to move and a solid seat behind heavy armor were things that kept him effective and kept him alive. The same size that made the airplane heavy made it survivable and, in its own way, humane to fly. The 8 guns and their thousands of rounds of ammunition added their own weight, hundreds of pounds of steel and brass carried in the wings, and every burst spent a fortune of it in seconds. The airplane was built to carry a great deal and to give it all back at once. That points to a myth worth addressing early, the idea that the Thunderbolt was simply clumsy, a truck of an airplane that could not maneuver. The record is more balanced. It was heavy in the climb, no argument, and a light, well-flown enemy could outclimb it and outturn it in a slow fight. But it rolled quickly, it dived like nothing else in the sky, and at high speed it was a stable, hard-hitting gun platform. Clumsy is the wrong word. Heavy is the right one, and heavy is not the same thing. The trade-off that defines this chapter is the one that would nearly break the airplane's early career. The thirst was the Thunderbolt's original sin. All that internal machinery, all that weight, all that power came with a fuel burn that put German airspace out of reach in the first months of operations. The very qualities that let it own the high air, the big engine and the turbo that fed it, were the qualities that kept it from staying in that air long enough to matter. Range would become the problem the whole force had to solve. To understand why the airplane looked the way it did, deep-bellied and barrel-chested and unlike any fighter beside it, the machinery inside has to be followed directly. The shape was not a choice of style. It was the room, a single stream of air needed to travel, and that journey is the next part of the story. The Thunderbolt's shape was not a decision about beauty. It was the space a single stream of air needed to complete its journey and keep the engine alive at 40,000 feet. Every other fighter hit its supercharger against the back of the engine, close and compact. The Thunderbolt did something different, and the difference is written across its whole silhouette. To understand the airplane, follow one breath of air from the moment it enters to the moment it leaves. The breath begins at an intake beneath the engine, at the front of that deep belly. Cool outside air is drawn in and split. Some of it feeds the engine directly. A great deal of it is sent rearward, down through the fuselage, in a duct that runs most of the length of the airplane. This is the first surprise of the design. The machinery that pressurizes the air does not sit up front by the engine at all. It sits far back, below and behind the pilot, near the tail. The air has to travel to reach it. At the back of the airplane waits the turbo supercharger. It is fed by the engine's own exhaust. The 18 cylinders of the Double Wasp, instead of dumping their spent gas straight overboard through short stacks the way a simpler fighter would, send it down long tailpipes that run aft through the fuselage to that same rear compartment. There, the hot exhaust, still carrying enormous energy, is aimed at the blades of a turbine wheel. It spins. At full power, that turbine reaches speeds on the order of 21,000 revolutions a minute, a small wheel screaming in the belly of the airplane, driven entirely by gas that a lesser design would have thrown away. On the same shaft as that turbine sits a compressor, and here the breath is transformed. The compressor seizes the incoming air and squeezes it, packing the thin, high-altitude atmosphere back to the density the engine needs. But squeezing air heats it, and hot air is thin air again, which would undo the work. So the compressed, heated air does not go straight to the engine. It is turned around and sent forward once more, back up the length of the fuselage, through an intercooler, a radiator for air rather than water, where a separate flow of cool outside atmosphere strips the heat away. Doors on the sides of the fuselage dump that spent cooling air overboard. Only now, cooled and dense and forward again near the engine, is the air delivered to the carburetor and fed into the cylinders to be burned. The whole circuit has run the length of the airplane twice, down the belly as exhaust and intake, back up as pressurized cooled charge. A valve called the wastegate governs the entire process, bleeding off exhaust when full boost is not needed, and closing to send everything to the turbine when the pilot demands all the airplane has. Managing it was part of the pilot's craft. Mishandled, the system could overspeed or flood the engine with more than it could take. None of this ran cool or quiet. The exhaust piped through the belly carried the raw heat of 18 cylinders burning at full power, and at the turbine that gas struck the blades hot enough to make them glow. A system like that, threaded through the same fuselage that carried the fuel and the pilot, had to be built and sealed with great care, because a failure was not a stalled engine but a fire in the heart of the airplane. That was the hidden burden the Thunderbolt carried on every flight, a furnace of exhaust running past the cockpit, tamed by good engineering and constant maintenance. The reward for carrying it was the one thing that mattered, an engine that kept its full strength into air so thin that other fighters could barely stay aloft. The airplane paid for its high-altitude power with heat, weight, and risk, folded invisibly into its shape. That is the reason for the shape. The deep, portly fuselage that gave the Thunderbolt its nickname was not fat, it was full. Every inch of that belly held ducting, the turbine, the intercooler, and the piping that connected them, all of it packaged inside the airframe rather than hung outside in the wind. A popular way of describing the airplane is to call it ugly or bloated, as though the designers had simply failed to make it trim. That reading gets the airplane backward. The depth was the machinery. Kartvelli's team had taken the bulkiest high-altitude system of its day and swallowed it whole inside a clean airframe, and the barrel chest was the honest outline of what that cost. The advantage of driving the pump this way is worth making plain, because it is the whole reason for the airplane's complexity. Most fighters used a supercharger geared directly to the engine, a pump spun by the crankshaft. That works, but it steals power from the engine to run, and its output falls away as the airplane climbs beyond the altitude it was geared for. The turbo supercharger took a different bargain. It ran on exhaust gas, energy already spent and otherwise wasted out the back, and it could be regulated to hold its boost far higher into the sky. The cost of that bargain was everything already described: The length of ducting, the turbine, the intercooler, the weight, and the bulk. Republic had chosen the harder, heavier, better breathing path, and the deep belly was the shape of that choice made visible. The pilot, for all this, saw none of it. He felt only the result. As he climbed, the engine did not fade. Where a lighter fighter would grow soft and breathless, the Thunderbolt kept pulling, its turbine spinning faster to make up for the thinning air, its power holding into heights other single-engined fighters could not use. The machinery was invisible to him, and total in its effect. He had, in effect, an engine that refused to notice altitude, and that was the entire point of the airplane. The gift and the cost were, as always, the same object. The turbo supercharger gave the Thunderbolt the best high-altitude breathing in the American single-engine arsenal, the power to fight where the war was going. It also gave the airplane its belly, its weight, and its complexity. Every foot of ducting was structure to build, mass to lift, and one more path that could leak, burn, or fail. The airplane breathed better than anything near it because it carried more machinery than anything near it, and machinery, in the end, is weight and trouble in equal measure. A machine this intricate posed a question beyond the drawing board. It was hard enough to build one. The war would need many thousands, built fast, built identically, by workers who had never seen a turbo supercharger in their lives. That was a different kind of problem, and it was its own war. Designing the Thunderbolt was hard. Building 15,000 of them was harder. The drawing that Cartvelli sketched on a train was a feat of engineering. Turning it into more than 15,000 identical, intricate airplanes was a feat of industry, and the industrial story is where the airplane's real scale becomes visible. The final tally was 15,636 aircraft. That figure needs stating plainly, because it is easy to round it up. Some accounts give 15,660 or 15,683, and the numbers drift depending on how prototypes and canceled contracts are counted. The record best supports 15,636, more Thunderbolts than any other American fighter type of the war. Whatever the exact last digit, the shape of the fact is fixed. This was the most produced American fighter ever built, and it stayed in production until the end of December 1945, longer than any other Army fighter of the conflict. They came from 3 places. The heart of the operation was Republic's own plant at Farmingdale, on Long Island, where the airplane was born and where the newest models were developed and first built. A second Republic plant at Evansville, in Indiana, was raised to multiply the output, turning out both the earlier framed canopy machines and the later ones. And a third stream came from a competitor. Curtiss-Wright, at Buffalo, built the Thunderbolt under license, producing 354 aircraft designated P-47G. That a rival firm was pressed into building someone else's design says everything about the demand. The war did not care whose name was on the drawing, it wanted airframes. The production numbers by model trace the airplane's growth. The first service version, the P-47B, ran to 171 aircraft, the toe in the water. The P-47C followed with a few hundred more, working out the early faults. Then came the Great Flood, the P-47D, built in 2 broad families. The earlier framed canopy Diaz, the Razorbacks, ran to more than 9,500 aircraft across dozens of production blocks. The later bubble canopy Diaz added more than 3,000 on top of that. Specialized versions followed in smaller numbers, 130 of the high-speed meters model and over 1,800 of the long-ranged N. The bulk of the entire program was that one letter, the D, built and rebuilt and refined block by block until it filled the sky. Behind those numbers were people who had never built anything like this. A turbo-supercharged fighter was among the most complex machines of its age, and it was being assembled by a wartime workforce, many of them new to aviation, many of them women, who had entered the plants as the men left for the services. On the line at Evansville, a worker might spend the war riveting belly panels around ductwork she would never see fly, fitting the skin over the very plumbing that gave the airplane its shape. Each of them held one small, exact piece of a machine none of them could see whole. The training of that workforce was itself a feat to rival the engineering. A person who had never held an air-driven rivet gun had to be taught, in weeks, to build a part of a fighter to tolerances measured in fractions of an inch, and to build it the same way every time, because the next part down the line depended on it. The plants broke the airplane into thousands of small, learnable jobs, each one a task a newcomer could master, and the sum of all those mastered small jobs was a combat aircraft rolling out the door. It was the logic of mass production applied to one of the most demanding machines yet built. And it worked because the design had been drawn, from the start, to be built in quantity. An airplane too clever to manufacture is a failed airplane, no matter how it flies. The Thunderbolt was clever and buildable at once, and the second quality mattered as much as the first. The airplane was not cheap in the way a rifle is cheap, but it was affordable at scale in the way that mattered to a nation building an air force. Each Thunderbolt cost on the order of $85,000 in the money of the day, and the whole program ran into the region of $1 billion, a vast sum spent to put thousands of these machines over Europe and the Pacific. That was the arithmetic of industrial war. A single airplane was expensive. 15,000 of them, built on lines that grew more efficient with every block, were something a country could actually field, and the ability to build them in quantity was itself a weapon. The Buffalo aircraft tell a quieter story about that scale. The 354 Thunderbolts that Curtiss built were not, in the main, sent into combat as first-line fighters. Many served in the United States as training aircraft, giving new pilots hours on the type before they crossed an ocean to fight in it. It was a sensible division of labor, letting the license-built machines shoulder the training burden while the Republic plants fed the combat squadrons. And it is a reminder that building an air force is not only about the airplanes at the front. It is about the whole pipeline behind them, the trainers and the spares and the schools, all of which the production program had to feed at once. That scale of production put an unforgiving demand on precision. When 3 factories build the same airplane, and when parts made in one place must fit airframes assembled in another, interchangeability stops being a convenience and becomes a law. A component built at Buffalo had to drop into a fuselage built at Farmingdale. That discipline reached down to the smallest fittings, and it is where the cost of the whole system was most sharply felt. An error caught early cost a single part. The same error discovered after assembly, buried under skin and ducting, could stop an aircraft or send a whole batch back for rework. The deeper a mistake hid before it was found, the more it cost to fix. There was a price to the license approach, as there is to everything in this airplane's story. Spreading production across 3 plants and 2 companies bought volume that a single factory could never have reached, and volume was the entire object. It cost a mountain of coordination, an obsessive standardization of tooling and parts, and a constant fight to keep 3 separate production lines building genuinely identical machines. The Thunderbolt was cheap enough to build in the sense that mattered, that it could be built in enormous numbers, but that cheapness was bought with relentless industrial effort behind the scenes. 15,000 airframes, though, are only aluminum and steel until the teeth are bolted on. What made the Thunderbolt a weapon rather than a very large flying machine was concentrated in its wings and in the massive engine ahead of the pilot, and that armament is the next part of the story. The Thunderbolt carried more firepower than any fighter it was likely to meet. It also carried, ahead of the pilot, the very thing that made it survivable. Those 2 facts, the guns and the engine, are the airplane's teeth and its armor, and they are best understood together because both grew from the same decision to build big. The teeth were 8 machine guns, not 4, not 6, but 8 50-caliber Browning Meters 2s, 4 in each wing, each fed by its own belt of ammunition, 425 rounds to a gun, roughly 3,400 rounds in all. When a pilot pressed the trigger, all 8 fired together, and the weight of metal they threw was without equal among single-engine fighters. The Thunderbolt's guns delivered on the order of 12.5 pounds of lead every second. Its contemporaries, firing lighter batteries, threw something closer to 9. That difference sounds small on paper and was decisive in the air. A firing pass, measured in a second or 2, put a wall of heavy bullets across the target, and the 50-caliber round carried far, hit hard, and kept its energy at range. The ammunition itself was chosen to do more than punch holes. The belts were loaded with a mixture of rounds, armor-piercing to bite through metal, incendiary to set fuel and fabric alight, tracer to show the pilot where his fire was going. A burst from 8 guns was not a single kind of blow, but several at once, boring, burning, and marking. And against a thin-skinned truck or a locomotive's boiler or an aircraft's fuel tank, the effect was ruinous. 3,400 rounds sounds like a great deal, and it is, until it is set against the rate at which 8 guns consume it. Firing all 8, a pilot emptied his tanks in well under a minute of total trigger time. That was the discipline the Thunderbolt demanded. Its firepower was overwhelming, and its magazine was finite, and a pilot who sprayed his ammunition at long range came home with empty guns and nothing to show. The good ones fired in short, close bursts, spending that enormous punch a second or 2 at a time, making each pass count. Aiming that firepower got easier as the war went on. Later, Thunderbolts carried a gyroscopic gun sight, a device that computed the lead a pilot needed to hit a moving target and showed it to him as a moving dot, turning the difficult art of deflection shooting into something a competent pilot could do reliably. The 8 guns had always thrown a devastating weight of metal. The improved sight helped put that metal where it needed to go, and it lifted the effectiveness of the whole airplane without changing a single gun. It was a reminder that a weapon is not only its hardware, it is the hardware plus the means of aiming it, and the Thunderbolt's punch grew sharper even as the guns themselves stayed the same. The airplane could carry more than guns. Under the wings and belly, it could hang up to 2,500 pounds of bombs, and later it carried rockets, Up to 10 5-inch high-velocity aerial rockets slung beneath the wings, each striking with something like the force of a field artillery shell. A fighter that began as a high-altitude interceptor could, by this arrangement, deliver the punch of a light bomber. That capacity was not in the original brief. It was latent in the airplane's size, waiting for a war that would ask for it. The armor was the engine. The R-2800 was an air-cooled radial, a great disc of 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rings, weighing on the order of a ton in itself. Air-cooled meant something vital in combat. It had no radiator, no network of coolant lines, no delicate liquid circuit that a single bullet could open. A liquid-cooled engine, for all its aerodynamic grace, could be killed by one hit to a coolant line, bleeding out its lifeblood in minutes until it seized. The double wasp had no such throat to cut. A cylinder could be shot clean off, and the engine would often keep running on the remaining 17. And that mass of metal sat directly between the pilot and whatever he was flying toward, a ton of engine block that absorbed frontal fire before it ever reached the man. The pilot flew behind a shield he could not have designed better if he had tried. The airplane also learned to control its own speed. In a steep dive, the Thunderbolt accelerated ferociously, faster than almost anything, and at the highest speeds it ran into a wall that early pilots did not understand and some did not survive. As the airflow over the wings approached the speed of sound in places, the controls could grow heavy and strange, the airplane reluctant to recover, a phenomenon called compressibility. In the worst cases, the controls seemed to lock, the nose stayed down, and a pilot could ride a screaming dive all the way into the ground, unable to pull out, killed by a problem no one had fully understood when the airplane was designed. It was a new kind of danger, born from the fact that fighters had finally grown fast enough to brush against the physics of high speed, and the Thunderbolt, as one of the fastest divers in the sky, met it early. The answer, fitted to later machines, was a set of small dive flaps under the wings that the pilot could deploy to keep the airplane controllable as it plunged, changing the airflow just enough to let him recover. It was a fix for a problem the design's own diving strength had created, and it turned a potentially fatal trait into a usable tactic. That diving strength is tangled with one of the airplane's more colorful legends. In 1942, Republic reported that its test pilots had pushed the Thunderbolt in a dive to the very edge of the sound barrier, and the story hardened over time into a claim that the airplane had broken it. That claim requires restraint. The record shows the Thunderbolt was a superb diver that ran hard into compressibility, the same wall that fitted it with dive flaps. It did not break the sound barrier, and the instruments of the day could not even have measured such a thing reliably. The reason the myth felt true is that the airplane genuinely could outdive its enemies, plunging away from a fight faster than they could follow. The evidence supports a magnificent diver, not a record breaker, and the magnificent diver is impressive enough. The trade-off in the airplane's teeth and armor is the trade-off of the whole design, seen close up. The air-cooled radial that shrugged off hits and shielded the pilot was heavier and bulkier than a sleek liquid-cooled inline, and it cost the airplane some speed and some grace. The 8 guns and their ammunition were hundreds of pounds carried in the wings whether or not they were firing. Everything that made the Thunderbolt deadly and hard to kill also made it heavy, and heavy was the price stamped on every page of its story. It bought survivability and firepower with weight, and it paid that bill gladly. None of it counted for anything, though, if the airplane could not reach the fight. Teeth and armor are useless on a machine that runs out of fuel over the channel. And in its first months of combat, that was very nearly the Thunderbolt's fate. The Thunderbolt was built to guard bombers all the way to Germany. In its first months over Europe, it could barely cross the French coast before it had to turn for home. That gap between the mission and the machine is the hardest chapter in the airplane's early career, and it had nothing to do with how the Thunderbolt fought. It had everything to do with how far it could go. The problem was the fuel arithmetic laid down in the design. The airplane carried a large internal load, but the engine that gave it its altitude and its firepower was a heavy drinker, burning on the order of 100 gallons an hour at the powers combat demanded. A big tank feeding a thirsty engine is a short-legged airplane. Early combat radius, the distance out to the fight and safely back with a reserve, came to something on the order of 160-odd miles. From bases in England, that was not far enough. The bombers the Thunderbolt was meant to protect flew on, deep into occupied Europe and Germany, while their escorts reached the limit of their fuel and peeled away. Fighters could barely push 75 miles into France before the arithmetic ordered them back. The consequence was grim and simple. The bombers went on alone into the most dangerous airspace, precisely where German fighters waited, precisely where the escort was needed most. A fighter that owned the high air was useless to a bomber it could not reach. The Thunderbolt had been given the top of the sky and denied the range to use it where it counted. The fix was not a new airplane. It was a tank. External fuel tanks, hung under the belly and later under the wings, carried extra gallons that the airplane burned first and then dropped when they were empty or when combat began. The idea was old, but making it work at altitude and in quantity took effort. An early problem was that the first tanks could not feed fuel reliably at high altitude, where low pressure kept the fuel from flowing as it should, so a tank that added range on paper was useless at the heights the escorts flew until the plumbing was pressurized to force the fuel up. Tanks came in various forms as the problem was solved. Some were pressed paper tanks of around 108 gallons, a clever expedient developed in Britain, cheap to build, made from a material that was not needed for anything else, and expendable by design. Others were metal, larger, produced as supply allowed. Each increment of external fuel pushed the combat radius outward, a tank here, a bigger tank there, more of them under the wings, and step by step the Thunderbolt's reach extended from the French coast toward the German border and beyond, until late-war machines could accompany bombers over targets that had once been hopelessly far. The men who felt the difference most were the bomber crews, watching from their cold, exposed formations as the little friends held on farther and farther east with each passing month. Early in the campaign, they had learned the bitter sight of their escorts waving off over the channel. As the tanks came, that farewell moved deeper into enemy territory, and the escort stayed with them through more of the gauntlet. Among the units flying the Thunderbolt was the 56th Fighter Group, the outfit that would become known as Zemke's Wolfpack, after its commander Hubert Zemke, and it made the heavy fighter into a killer of German aircraft rather than merely a passenger over Europe. The Wolfpack became the proof of what the airplane could do when it reached the enemy. It stayed on the Thunderbolt when other groups converted to lighter fighters, and it ran up the highest tally of any American fighter group in the European theater, hundreds of German aircraft destroyed in the air. Its pilots became the leading aces of the campaign. Francis Gabreski, flying the heavy fighter, scored 28 aerial victories to become the top American ace in Europe. Robert Johnson, in the same group, reached 27. David Schilling added more than 20. These were not men flying a nimble little dogfighter. They were winning with the heavy, barrel-chested Thunderbolt, using its strengths, its diving speed, and its firepower, and its ability to take a hit, and refusing to fight the kind of slow, turning battle the airplane was bad at. The Wolfpack's record answered the doubters directly. In the right hands, with the right tactics, the Jug was a superb killer. The tactics mattered as much as the airplane. A Thunderbolt pilot learned not to try to turn with a lighter German fighter down low, where he would lose, but to use his height and his diving speed, to strike from above and climb away, to make the fight vertical and fast rather than slow and flat. Flown that way, the airplane's weight became an asset, carrying it through a diving pass and back up out of danger before the enemy could answer. Flown the wrong way, dragged into a low, slow, turning contest, the same airplane could be beaten. The machine set the terms, and the pilots who understood those terms prospered. Here, a myth deserves correction, because the range story is often flattened into a verdict that the Thunderbolt failed as an escort. That reading is unfair. The airplane did not fail as a fighter. It failed, at first, as a matter of geography, and geography was fixed with tanks. When it could reach the enemy, it fought superbly. Thunderbolts shot down more German aircraft than any other American fighter type in the theater, on the order of 3,500 of them, and across the war, the type finished with a favorable ratio of aerial victories to losses, something close to 4.5 to 1. The early escort trouble was real, but it was a fuel problem wearing the mask of a fighting problem. The airplane could always fight. For a while, it simply could not get there. The fix carried its own penalty, as fixes in this airplane always do. External tanks added range, but they also added drag and weight to a machine already heavy, slowing it and cutting its performance until they were dropped. A tank of fuel or gasoline hung in the slipstream was also a hazard, one more thing to catch fire, one more complication on takeoff and in combat. The Thunderbolt bought its reach the way it bought everything else, by carrying more, and paying for it in performance until the moment the tanks fell away. There was a deeper turn in the story, though, one that the range fix set in motion. Even as external tanks let the Thunderbolt escort deeper, a lighter, longer-legged fighter was arriving that would carry the bombers the whole way with less trouble, and the long escort mission would pass to it. That handoff might have ended the Thunderbolt's usefulness. Instead, it freed the airplane to discover what it was truly best at. And what it was best at was the one thing its toughness had been quietly promising all along. The proof came in, a single airplane that took everything a German fighter could give it and still flew home. On the 26th of June, 1943, a German fighter pilot emptied his guns into a Thunderbolt and could not bring it down. The airplane's entire reputation, the whole legend of toughness that outlived the war, begins in that one long, terrible flight back to England. It is worth telling closely, because it is the moment the airplane's character was proven in front of witnesses, one of them being the enemy who tried to kill it. The pilot was Robert Johnson, of the 56th Fighter Group's 61st Squadron, a young flyer who would end the war as one of the top American aces in Europe with 27 victories. On that day, early in his combat career, His Thunderbolt was hit hard and sent reeling out of formation, damaged and alone over occupied France. Trying to nurse the crippled fighter home, he was found by a German fighter, a Focke-Wulf 190, flown by an experienced hand widely identified as Egon Mayer. What followed was not a dogfight. It was an execution that would not take. Mayer settled in behind the wounded Thunderbolt and fired. His cannon, shells, and bullets walked across the airplane, shattering the canopy, tearing through the fuselage, cutting hydraulic and oil lines that sprayed their fluids back over the cockpit, wounding Johnson in the face and body with fragments and glass. An engine fire flared and then, strangely, went out on its own. Johnson could barely see. He could not properly work the ruined controls, and still the airplane flew. Mayer pulled alongside, looked the battered machine over, dropped back, and fired again and again, circling and shooting until his ammunition ran low. His heavier cannon shells were spent, and he was reduced to hammering the Thunderbolt with his lighter machine guns alone. The airplane absorbed it. When they neared the English coast and Mayer had nothing left to give, the German pilot drew up beside his stubborn enemy, rocked his wings in a gesture that was half salute and half disbelief, and turned for home. Johnson brought the Thunderbolt down in England, and when the airplane was examined, the Count told the story. The airframe held on the order of 21 20mm cannon strikes and more than 200 hits from machine gun bullets. It had been shot, by any reasonable measure, to scrap, and it had carried its pilot home. Johnson himself, characteristically, made light of his wounds, remarking that he had been hurt worse playing football and boxing, and he came away certain that none of the German fighters he faced were as rugged as his own. That story explains the airplane, but it also invites a myth that has to be handled with care. The Thunderbolt is sometimes remembered as indestructible, a fighter that could not be shot down. That claim requires restraint. The record is unambiguous that the type was lost in large numbers over the war, several thousand of them to all causes, to flak and fighters and accidents and weather. No airplane that goes to war comes home every time. What the evidence supports is not invulnerability, but exceptional survivability. The Thunderbolt's loss rate, measured against the enormous number built and the punishing work it did, was strikingly low, well under 1% of the airframes produced. The myth felt true, because stories like Johnson's were common enough that pilots came to trust the airplane in a way they trusted few machines. It was the toughest fighter many of them had ever seen. It was not, and no airplane is, unkillable. The reason for the toughness was built into the design, and it comes back to the choices of the earlier chapters. The air-cooled radial had no coolant system to be punctured, no fragile liquid circuit that a single round could open, and it would run on missing cylinders. That mass of engine shielded the pilot from the front. The airplane's very size meant that structure was heavy and redundant, that a shell could pass through without finding anything vital, that there was simply more airplane between any given bullet and the things that mattered. The weight that cost the Thunderbolt its climb and its early range was the same weight that brought its pilots home. Survivability was not a lucky accident. It was the reverse side of every disadvantage the airplane carried. The contrast with a liquid-cooled fighter makes the point sharp. An inline engine of the era was cooled by fluid pumped through the block and out to a radiator, and that system was its weakness in a gunfight. A single bullet through a coolant line, a single fragment in the radiator, and the engine would begin to overheat and seize within minutes, no matter how strong the rest of the airplane was. The most graceful fighter in the sky could be brought down by one lucky hit to a pipe the width of a thumb. The Thunderbolt had no such pipe to hit. Its engine was cooled by the air rushing past it, and the only way to stop it was to destroy it outright. In the kind of low, close, dirty fighting the airplane would inherit, where every machine took hits, that difference was not a detail. It was the difference between a pilot who walked away and a pilot who did not. Johnson's flight was the famous case, but it was not unique, and that is the real point. Pilots across the force came home in Thunderbolts that should not have flown, with cylinders shot away, with skin peeled back, with holes a man could put his arm through, and the frequency of such returns is what built the airplane's reputation among the men who flew it. They did not trust the jug because of one story. They trusted it because they kept seeing it happen, kept watching battered Thunderbolts come over the fence and land, kept climbing back into an airplane that had a habit of getting people home. Reputation among fighter pilots was not sentiment. It was hard experience, repeated, and the Thunderbolt earned it the hard way. The toughness did something to the men as well as to the airplanes, and it is worth naming because it changed how they fought. A pilot who believes his airplane will bring him home flies differently from one who fears every burst of fire will be the end of him. He presses the attack a moment longer. He goes back in for another pass. He bores through the flak toward the target instead of flinching away. That confidence, earned by watching Thunderbolts absorb punishment and keep flying, was itself a weapon, because it turned pilots into men who would take the risks the mission required. The airplane's steel and aluminum protected their bodies. Its reputation, just as importantly, steadied their nerves. There is a hard irony in that. A fighter this good at surviving damage was, in a sense, wasted at high altitude, where the goal was to shoot the enemy down before he ever landed a hit. The Thunderbolt's deepest talent was for taking hits and staying up, and the place where that talent mattered most was not 5 miles high in clean air. It was down low, in the dirt and the flak, where every airplane got hit and only the strong came home. The war was about to send the Thunderbolt exactly there. The interceptor built for the stratosphere found its real war a few hundred feet above the ground. History took the high-altitude fighter and handed it the dirtiest, most dangerous job in the sky, and the airplane turned out to have been built for it all along, though no one had planned it that way. The Thunderbolt became the great fighter bomber of the Western War, and it did so by descending from the height it was designed to rule. The shift gathered force through the spring of 1944 and became a flood after the invasion of Europe. As the longer-ranged escort passed to other machines, the Thunderbolt was turned loose on the enemy's ground. It flew low-level bombing and strafing missions, roaming over occupied France and Germany, hunting anything that moved on road or rail. In the campaigns that followed the Normandy landings, through the breakout, through the airborne battles, through the desperate winter fighting in the Ardennes, the Thunderbolt was the airplane that came down out of the clouds onto the German army. It carried its bombs and rockets to the target and then emptied its 8 guns into whatever was left. The numbers attached to that work are staggering, and they need to be handled honestly. Tallies from the campaign in the West credit Thunderbolts and their fellow fighter bombers with tens of thousands of locomotives, rail cars, armored vehicles, and trucks destroyed, figures that run into the 6 figures when combined. Those famous numbers need context. They rest on pilot claims made in the chaos of low-level attack, where the same burning truck could be counted by more than one flyer, where a locomotive venting steam looked destroyed whether or not it was, where certainty was impossible at 200 miles an hour under fire. The totals are real evidence of a colossal effort and a genuine slaughter of the German supply system. They are not an audited ledger. The right way to hold them is as the measure of a campaign that helped strangle an army's ability to move, without treating every claimed locomotive as a confirmed kill. What is not in doubt is what the airplane meant to the men on both sides. To German soldiers on the roads of France, the fighter bomber was a constant terror, the thing that made daylight movement deadly and turned every march and every convoy into a gamble against the sky. To the Allied soldiers below, the Thunderbolt overhead was a promise that the enemy's tanks and trucks would be hunted before they arrived. The airplane that had been drawn to fight thin air at 40,000 feet was now most feared and most loved a few hundred feet up, in the smoke and the flak. The way the airplane was used grew as sophisticated as the machine itself. The tactical air commands learned to work hand in glove with the armies on the ground, and the Thunderbolt was the tool that made it work. Fighter bombers were held on call, sometimes circling above the advancing columns, sometimes waiting on strip alert, ready to be directed onto a target by controllers riding with the forward troops. A tank column that ran into a strongpoint could call for air power and have Thunderbolts rolling in with bombs and rockets in minutes rather than hours. In the Great Encirclements, when a trapped German army tried to escape down choked roads, the fighter bombers turned those roads into killing grounds, catching vehicles bumper to bumper with nowhere to go. The airplane's heavy load and its survivability made it ideal for the work, and the close cooperation between the men in the cockpits and the men in the tanks became one of the decisive Allied advantages of the campaign in the West. That cooperation reached its grim peak in the summer and winter battles after the invasion. In the breakout fighting, Thunderbolts helped seal the roads as a German army was encircled and destroyed. In the desperate winter counteroffensive in the Ardennes, once the weather cleared enough to fly, the fighter bombers fell on the German columns that had gambled everything on bad weather grounding Allied air power, and the clearing skies were a catastrophe for the attackers. Over and over, the same pattern held. Where the Thunderbolts could fly, the German army could not move by day, and an army that cannot move by day loses the initiative it needs to win. The place where a man stood to feel all this was the cockpit on a strafing run. Ground attack meant flying straight into the one thing every airplane fears: concentrated anti-aircraft fire, at low altitude, where there was no room to recover and no height to trade for time. The Thunderbolt pilot pushed his airplane down a line of railway or a column of vehicles while the ground threw everything it had back up at him. And here, the ton of air-cooled engine ahead of him earned its keep every second. The very survivability that had brought Robert Johnson home was now the daily difference between a pilot who returned from a flak-lined rail cut and one who did not. The radial engine chewed shrapnel and kept turning. The heavy structure took hits and held together. That points to the true cost of the airplane's new role, and it is a somber one. Ground attack made the Thunderbolt indispensable, and it killed more of its pilots than aerial combat ever did. Strafing was statistically the most dangerous work a fighter pilot could do, more lethal than dogfighting, because the enemy on the ground could not be shot down or driven off and simply kept firing. The Thunderbolt's toughness is often celebrated, and rightly. What is said less often is that its toughness was constantly needed precisely because the job the airplane had inherited was so deadly. The airplane came home riddled so often because it was sent, day after day, into fire that riddled it. Survivability and slaughter were two names for the same missions. The airplane's work began before the invasion, in the long campaign to wreck the enemy's ability to reinforce. In the weeks leading up to the landings, fighter bombers ranged across the transport network behind the coast, cutting rail lines, dropping bridges, and shooting up the locomotives and rolling stock the Germans needed to rush troops to the beaches. That interdiction was not glamorous, and it did not make aces, but it helped ensure that when the invasion came, the enemy could not move his reserves freely to meet it. The Thunderbolt, with its heavy load and its ability to press home an attack through defended airspace, was one of the principal tools of that patient. Grinding, decisive work. The Thunderbolt fought this low war beyond the fields of France as well. In Italy, it flew for the air forces operating over the mountains and the German lines. In the vast theater of China, Burma, and India, its ruggedness and its ability to keep flying at the end of a long and primitive supply chain made it valuable where more delicate machines struggled. And in the final months, the long-winged Thunderbolts reached the Pacific in their intended role. Flying from hard-won islands to escort bombers over the Japanese home islands and to strafe the enemy's shrinking defenses, the airplane's endurance stretched at last to the ocean it had been rebuilt for. It never became the dominant fighter of the Pacific in the way it dominated the ground war in Europe. But where it went, it brought the same qualities, the same guns, the same shield, the same stubborn refusal to fall. An airplane worked this hard could not stay the same. To keep doing the job, to survive the flak and reach the far theaters and meet new enemies in the air, the Thunderbolt itself had to keep changing. And it changed more than almost any fighter of the war. The Thunderbolt that ended the war did not look like the one that started it. Combat rewrote the airplane block by block, and by 1945 it had grown a new canopy, longer wings, and versions that chased problems the original designers never imagined. The letter D alone was built and rebuilt through dozens of production blocks, each one carrying small changes that added up to a different airplane. The most visible change answered a complaint that cost lives. The early Thunderbolt carried a framed canopy behind a raised spine, the shape that earned it the Razorback name. It looked purposeful, and it half-blinded the pilot to the rear. A fighter pilot who cannot see behind him cannot see the enemy who is about to kill him, and rearward visibility was the difference between spotting an attacker and being bounced. The fix came from across the Atlantic. British designers had fitted a rounded, frameless bubble canopy to their own fighters, and the idea was adapted to the Thunderbolt. A test installation flew in the summer of 1943, and from a production block late in the D-series, the bubble top became standard, cutting down the spine and dropping a clear teardrop of canopy over the cockpit that gave the pilot a view in every direction. That improvement created a new problem, in the way this airplane always did. Cutting away the Razorback spine removed side area behind the cockpit and slightly upset the airplane's directional steadiness. The answer on later machines was a small dorsal fin added ahead of the tail to restore what the bubble canopy had taken away. It is a small detail, an easy thing to miss on the finished airplane, and it is a perfect miniature of the whole Thunderbolt story. Every gain was paid for somewhere, and the fix for one problem quietly created the next. Under the skin, the airplane's power kept climbing. Later engines gained water injection, a system that sprayed a water and alcohol mixture into the cylinders for short bursts of emergency power, letting the pilot pull more from the engine when he needed to escape or to close a gap. The propeller changed, too, from the earlier blades to a broader, paddle-bladed design that bit more air and improved the climb that had always been the airplane's weakest quality. A Thunderbolt of 1944 could get up and go in a way the early machines could not, chasing away the reputation for sluggishness one modification at a time. Not every pilot welcomed every change, and the canopy is the clearest example. The bubble top gave a magnificent view, and most flyers were glad of it. But the older Razorback had virtues of its own that were quietly lost. The framed spine behind the cockpit gave the airplane a little more directional stability and, some pilots felt, a stronger structure over their heads. A few veterans preferred the machine they had learned to trust. It is a small thing, but it captures how a combat airplane really evolves. There is rarely a change that is pure gain. There is a change that helps more than it hurts, adopted because the balance of the fight has shifted, and the old hands who remember what was given up are not always wrong to miss it. Then came the specialists. The P-47 Meters was a sprinter, built in a hurry to answer new threats in the air over Europe. The German jet fighters and the flying bombs, both of them fast enough to outrun a standard Thunderbolt. The jets, in particular, were a warning from the future, aircraft that made every piston fighter look slow, and the flying bombs were small, fast, and pilotless, hard to catch before they reached their targets. The answer, for the moment, was to wring every last mile an hour out of the existing airframe. Around 130 meters models were built, fitted with the most powerful engines the line could deliver, stripped of the racks and fittings that added drag, and they could reach speeds approaching 470 miles an hour, well beyond the standard fighter. Rushed into service, they arrived with engine troubles that had to be sorted out in the field, teething problems that came from pushing the design hard and fast, and by the time they were right, the war in Europe was nearly over. They were the fastest Thunderbolts to see real service, and they came too late to change much. They were also a quiet admission that the piston fighter was reaching its ceiling, that no amount of horsepower would let a propeller-driven airplane chase a jet forever, and that the age the Thunderbolt had been born into was already ending even as the airplane reached its peak. The P-47N was the opposite kind of specialist, built not for speed but for distance, and built for a different ocean. The war against Japan was a war of enormous distances, and even the Thunderbolt's improved range was not enough to escort bombers across the Pacific. So the airplane was given a new wing, longer, with squared-off tips, and crucially with fuel tanks built inside it, raising the internal fuel to over 550 gallons and pushing the maximum range toward 2,300 miles. More than 1,800 were built. The N could stay in the air for 8 hours, far longer than the pilot was comfortable, and it was intended to shepherd the great bombers over the Japanese home islands. It was the Thunderbolt taken to its logical end. The airplane's endless appetite for carrying more finally turned toward carrying enough fuel to cross an ocean. The long-range mission changed the airplane in ways that had nothing to do with combat and everything to do with endurance. 8 hours strapped into a cockpit, most of it over empty ocean, is a punishing thing to ask of a pilot, and the N was fitted to help him survive the boredom and the fatigue as much as the enemy. It carried an autopilot to hold the airplane steady on the long, straight legs, so the pilot did not have to fly every mile by hand. The new wing was built not only to hold fuel, but to carry the extra weight of a fully loaded machine that grossed more than any Thunderbolt before it. This was no longer quite the same kind of airplane that had climbed to intercept bombers over Europe. It was a long-distance escort that happened to share a fuselage with a fighter, and it showed how far a sound basic design could be stretched when the war demanded it. At the far edges of the program were the experiments, the airframes built to chase raw numbers. One version was fitted with an entirely different engine, an inverted liquid-cooled design, to see what it would do. Another, stripped and refined for speed, reached around 505 miles an hour in testing and is sometimes called the fastest piston-engined fighter of its day. That claim needs restraint. It was a single experimental machine, built to explore the limit, not a version any squadron ever flew. The record supports it as a laboratory result, an interesting proof of how far the basic design could be pushed, and not as a combat aircraft. The Thunderbolts that fought the war were the D and the M and the N, not the record setters. The trade-off across all of it was the same one, followed to its end. The N solved the Pacific range problem by adding still more wing, more fuel, and more weight to an airplane that had never been light, until the fighter, drawn as a high-altitude interceptor, had become an 8-hour ocean-crossing machine of over 8 tons loaded. Each version was better at its narrow job and heavier for it. The design had enormous room to grow because it had been built big from the first sketch, and it spent the whole war growing, always in the same direction, always toward more. By 1945, the factories had built more Thunderbolts than the United States alone could use, and the airplane's American war was ending. Its flying life, though, had barely reached its midpoint, because the same ruggedness that made it a workhorse made it a perfect airplane to hand to someone else. The Thunderbolt's American war ended in 1945. Its flying life had not reached the halfway mark. The airplane was too rugged, too simple to maintain in its fundamentals, and too available in surplus to retire when the fighting stopped, and it went on flying under a dozen other flags, some of them for another 20 years. It had flown for allies during the war itself. Under Lend-Lease, more than 800 Thunderbolts went to Britain and the Commonwealth, where the Royal Air Force flew them not over Europe but in the east, in the steaming skies over Burma and India, hammering Japanese positions and supply lines in exactly the low, hard, ground attack work the airplane had grown into. British squadrons found the Thunderbolt well suited to the theater, a rugged airplane that could take the heat and the primitive conditions and deliver a heavy blow far from its bases, and they flew it in the long campaign to push the Japanese back through the jungle. Nearly 500 went to the Free French forces, rebuilding their air arm as they returned to the fight, flying the Thunderbolt in the campaign in the south of Europe and beyond. Around 400 went to the Soviet Union, where they were received with less enthusiasm, a high-altitude escort fighter delivered to an air force that fought mostly low and close over the Eastern Front, and where the airplane never quite found the role it was best at. The mismatch is instructive. The very qualities that made the Thunderbolt precious to the American bomber force, its altitude and its reach, were of little use to an air force that lived at treetop height over the front, and a magnificent airplane can still be the wrong airplane for the war a particular ally is fighting. 2 smaller Allied contingents carried the Thunderbolt with particular pride. Brazil sent a fighter squadron to Italy, flying Thunderbolts alongside the American Air Forces in the campaign up the peninsula, its pilots pressing home ground attack missions under their own flag. Mexico raised an expeditionary squadron, remembered as the Aztec Eagles, and sent it to the Pacific, where its pilots flew Thunderbolts on combat missions over the Philippines in the closing phase of the war. For both nations, the Thunderbolt was the airplane in which they took their place in the Allied air war, and the airplane's history is woven into theirs. After the war, the surplus flood carried the Thunderbolt around the world. It was cheap, it was available in enormous numbers, and its rugged airframe and reliable air-cooled engine made it ideal for air forces without the money or the infrastructure to support delicate machines. Squadrons of Thunderbolts flew on into the 1950s in Turkey, in Portugal, in Italy, in Iran. Across the Pacific, the airplanes served the nationalist Chinese forces on Taiwan, tangling with communist fighters off the mainland coast. And it took deep root in Latin America, flying with the air forces of Bolivia, Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, and the Dominican Republic, among others. The place where a person stood to feel that long afterlife was a maintenance hangar far from Long Island, decades after the war. Somewhere in South America in the 1960s, a mechanic was still keeping a Thunderbolt airworthy, coaxing a 20-year-old radial engine to life, fitting parts that Republic had stopped making, keeping a piece of 1943 flying in a world that had moved on to jets. Peru flew its Thunderbolts until 1966. More than 2 decades after the airframe rolled off the line, in an age of supersonic fighters, the big piston airplane was still on strength, still flying, still doing useful work. That endurance corrects a quiet myth of its own, the idea that the Thunderbolt simply vanished when the war ended, overshadowed by sleeker fighters and forgotten. The record shows the opposite. The airplane soldiered on in Air Force after Air Force, on several continents, straight into the jet age, long after many more glamorous designs had been scrapped. It did not disappear. It dispersed, and it kept flying. A handful outlived even their military careers. Of the more than 15,000 built, only a small number survive today, some in museums as static exhibits, a rare few still airworthy, restored at great expense, and flown at air shows by people who never saw the war. To stand beside one on the ground is to understand the numbers in a way no page can convey. The airplane is enormous for a single-engine fighter. Tall and deep and broad, the propeller a great 4-bladed fan overhead, the fuselage swelling around machinery that is no longer there to see. Every one of those survivors is a reminder that the drawing on the train became metal, that the metal went to war, and that a few pieces of it were saved from the scrapper's torch to show a later age what toughness looked like when it was still made of aluminum and steel. The trade-off held, even here, at the very end of the airplane's service life. The rugged simplicity of its fundamentals, the tough airframe and the forgiving engine, made the Thunderbolt a nearly perfect airplane to export and to maintain far from any factory. That same durability meant it stayed in frontline service in some countries long past the point where it was truly competitive, an old warrior kept in the ranks because it refused to wear out, flying into an era it had never been designed to see. The airplane was too tough to die on schedule. There is a verdict waiting in a service life like that. An airplane drawn for one job, sent to do another, built by the thousands and scattered across the world, retired only when the world had changed beyond recognition, is not easily summed up. The verdict on the Thunderbolt is not the one its designers expected, and it is not the one its detractors offered either, and it is time to render it. The Thunderbolt was called a compromise when it was drawn, and a workhorse when it was scrapped. Both verdicts are true, and both miss what the airplane actually proved. To judge it fairly, the numbers and the myths have to be set side by side one last time, and the airplane has to be measured against the job it did rather than the job it was given. The scale of its service is the first fact. More than 15,600 were built, the most of any American fighter. They flew on the order of 746,000 combat sorties in the war, an enormous total that speaks to how constantly the airplane worked. They finished with a favorable air-combat ratio, something near 4.5 victories for every loss, and a combat loss rate that, against the punishing ground attack missions the airplane flew, stayed remarkably low, well under 1% of the aircraft built. Those are not the numbers of a failure or a compromise. They are the numbers of an airplane that did a vast amount of dangerous work and brought most of its pilots home. It is worth pausing on what that loss rate means, because it is easy to read past. The Thunderbolt did the most dangerous flying of the air war, the low strafing runs into massed anti-aircraft fire that killed more fighter pilots than any dogfight, and it did that work hundreds of thousands of times, and still it lost fewer than one aircraft in 100 sorties to enemy action. No airplane sent into that kind of fire should have come home so reliably. That it did is the statistical shadow of Robert Johnson's single flight. The same toughness written not in one dramatic story but in the cold arithmetic of an entire fleet. The airplane's reputation and the airplane's numbers agree, and they agree because they are measuring the same thing. The Thunderbolt was built heavy, and heavy brought its pilots home at a rate no one had any right to expect. The requirement the Thunderbolt validated was not the one it was designed to meet. It was drawn to prove that America could build a high-altitude interceptor. And it did, briefly, before the war moved the goalposts. What it actually proved, over 3 years of combat, was that there was a need for a different kind of airplane entirely. A fighter rugged enough to absorb ground fire and keep flying, heavy enough to carry a bomber's load of ordnance to a battlefield, and simple enough in its vital systems to survive being hit again and again. Nobody had written that requirement down in 1940. The Thunderbolt discovered it by living it. There is a lesson in that about how weapons actually find their purpose, and it runs against the tidy way the story is usually told. Machines are designed to a specification, but they are judged by a war, and the war rarely asks the question the specification answered. The people who wrote the 1940 requirement imagined dueling with bombers in the stratosphere. The airplane they got spent most of its combat life a few hundred feet over the enemy's roads, doing work no one had specified, and it turned out to be one of the most valuable airplanes of the conflict precisely because of qualities that had been bought for another reason entirely. The weight was purchased for the turbo supercharger and spent on survivability. The size was purchased for altitude and spent on carrying bombs. Almost nothing about the Thunderbolt's greatness was planned. It was discovered, in contact with a war that refused to cooperate with the drawing. That is the right way to understand the airplane's place beside its famous stablemate. The Thunderbolt is often measured against the Mustang, the lighter, longer-legged fighter that took over the deep escort mission, and by the narrow test of escorting bombers to Berlin, the Mustang won. But that framing sets the wrong contest. The two airplanes answered two different questions. The Mustang answered the question of range, of how to put a fighter over the farthest target. The Thunderbolt answered the question of survivability and striking power, of how to build an airplane that could live in the flak and destroy an army's ability to move. The war needed both answers, and it would have been poorer for the loss of either. The Thunderbolt did not lose to the Mustang. It did a different job, and it did that job better than anything else in the sky. Even the airplane's name carries a small myth worth settling. The Thunderbolt was universally called the Jug, and the story is usually told that the name was short for Juggernaut, an unstoppable force. The evidence leans the other way. The nickname most likely came from the airplane's shape. The deep, bulging fuselage that looked like a milk jug or a bottle stood on its side, and Juggernaut was the flattering meaning attached afterward once the airplane had earned it. It is a fitting little tangle. The name began as a joke about how ungainly the airplane looked, and it ended as a tribute to how hard the airplane hit, and both meanings turned out to be true. The final trade-off is the verdict itself. The Thunderbolt was never the best in the sky at any single thing. It did not climb like a light interceptor. It did not turn like a nimble dogfighter, and it did not range like the Mustang without help. What it was, uniquely, was the airplane that could not be killed and could not be done without, the one that carried the heaviest guns, took the worst punishment, did the deadliest work, and came home. It bought that with weight, and weight was the price on every page of its story. And by the end, the price looked like a bargain. The lineage did not end when the last Thunderbolt was retired. Decades later, when the American Air Forces wanted a new airplane built around a job much like the one the Thunderbolt had grown into, an airplane made to fly low and slow over the battlefield, to absorb ground fire, to carry heavy weapons to the enemy's armor, and above all to bring its pilot home, they reached back for the name. They called it the Thunderbolt II. The dinosaur, it turned out, had left descendants. The entire story of the P-47, then, is the story of a machine that was right about everything except itself. Republic set out to build a fighter that would rule the top of the sky. The Army Air Corps needed a high-altitude interceptor, and Alexander Kartveli gave it one, throwing away the light fighter and drawing a dinosaur with good proportions around the biggest engine and the bulkiest turbo supercharger of the day. That decision made the airplane heavy, and the weight cost it climb and cost it range and very nearly cost it its early career, when it could barely reach France before turning for home. 15,000 of them were built across 3 factories, by workers who had never seen such a machine, and drop tanks slowly fixed the range while a lighter fighter took over the long escorts. Then history handed the interceptor the dirtiest job in the war and sent it down into the mud. And there, in the flak and the strafing runs, the weight that had been a curse became the thing that mattered most. The airplane that could take 21 cannon shells and 200 bullets and still fly home, as Robert Johnson's did, was exactly the airplane a pilot wanted when the enemy was on the ground and shooting back. It smashed the German supply system, terrified the soldiers on the roads, and outlived the war by 20 years in the air forces of a dozen nations, still flying over Peru into the middle of the 1960s. So how do you build a fighter heavy enough to survive everything the enemy can throw at it, without making it too heavy to do the job it was built for? The Thunderbolt's answer, in the end, was to fail at the first job and succeed at a better one. The builder accepts that it will never climb or range like a lighter machine, sends it to war expecting an interceptor, and discovers that the survivability paid for so dearly was the more valuable thing all along. The job it was built for passed to other airplanes. The job it was built to survive was the one that needed it. Republic built it to rule the top of the sky. History kept it alive at the bottom of it.